So some of the questions we wanted to ask as a result, and to look at particularly this population of men that may have had attempted at some time or had battled feelings of suicide, but had continued to cope in many aspects, are quite hard for men to fully for professionals to fully grasp, and therefore men often find ways to cope. And the other thing that I want to say about coping is coping is a very contested concept in social sciences, both sociology and psychology. And there's various arguments about coping, whether is coping just about survival, is it about thriving, is it about moving beyond a well-being model, is it a subsistence, or in some coping attempts actually counterproductive but keep someone entrenched within their current circumstances. So I want to acknowledge the complexity of coping here. But we have these questions. What coping strategies do men favour? What coping strategies have negative consequences? What coping strategies are positive or productive? What are the subjective meanings and manifestations of coping? So what do these mean for practitioners? So just some quick results from the actual survey analysis is largely not surprising here, is that men preferred substance abuse, and that was very commonly put forward as a mechanism of coping. And in some ways, it's important to understand this from a short-term and sustainable argument around coping. Suppression, well, that's hardly surprising when we think of disclosure rates amongst men and their reluctance to perhaps speak about abuse because of the fear and lack of acceptance in society. Disengagement is that men felt that they couldn't fully participate in relationships and social activities in a way that they wanted to. So most of these had these preferred coping strategies could be framed fairly negatively, but they are also protective coping strategies if we look at this critically. Least preferred religious, perhaps some men had been abused by clergy. Humour, and seeking emotional and social support. That men didn't feel that they could go out and seek assistance. And what's interesting there is that men who wanted emotional and social support, most of all wanted that from people that they were close to, rather than simply seeking that from professionals. And you know, if I think of my own life, I mean that's where I want my support. You know, I don't necessarily want it from a stranger that happens to be a professional. And I think that this is about that public health and broader issue associated with men and child sexual abuse. Okay. These are some of the things that predicted men to have perhaps what we could term a positive outcome or a negative outcome. And there's a couple of important things here. A positive outcome was predicted by positive coping strategies that were positive reinterpretation and growth. That is, men saw themselves, celebrated their survival and their coping and their thriving. They felt stronger as a result of what they'd had to do, and that they were viewing their experience with solidarity often with other survivors. The other thing was the use of instrumental social support, and the key word there is instrumental. That men didn't actually find it very helpful just to have social or emotional support per se in a cathartic way. They wanted some practical measures, that they felt there was some actual activities happening in terms of social support. And so we might come back to that. The unhelpful predictors are interesting. I mean, behavioural disengagement and suppression are not surprising. I've mentioned those. The interesting one here is acceptance, and we really wanted to flesh this out with the men in terms of when we interviewed the men. What did acceptance mean? Why was that perhaps associated with a less than desirable outcome? And the men, what we discovered was that the men really spoke about a feeling of being quite, if they accepted their lot in life of being abused and a whole range of the effects, then that was very damaging in terms of their overall well-being. So not feeling that they had any power over those situations, acceptance was not so helpful. And this runs counter to some other research in terms of coping strategies that might show that acceptance is actually a good thing in response to some situations of trauma, and is actively encouraged in some therapies. In this case, the research didn't really support that, and that supported the opposite.
Patrick, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
So if I'm thinking therapeutically about that, it would be important to me then to notice the sort of times when, either at the time or afterwards, men have contested what happened and made clear either by actions or by words or by absenting themselves away from the people involved, that this wasn't okay, this isn't something they wanted to do. To kind of make that visible to the men and talk with the men about that. Because in the process of saying, this was not okay for me.
Yeah. Just say a bit more what you mean.
Well, in the sense of, if I'm talking with a man about this, I'm looking all the time for moments when, he sort of took a stand against what was happening and was refusing to accept that. And even at times when you're talking, if you're saying acceptance is something you need to be careful of, it would be important to make it visible to him those moments, those times when he was very active either at the time, even by just like in the sense verbally or doing other stuff about saying this wasn't okay, and being clear about that as a means to make clear the unacceptable nature of what was going on.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think actually that works very well in a therapeutic context, is to put up those challenges that perhaps have been long, some realities or things that have been seen as a truth, so to speak, can be challenged with them, and that acceptance of those things can be sort of destabilised, if you like.
Okay, I'll leave you to go on with the presentation.
Sure.
Thanks a lot, Patrick.
No, and please, everyone, feel free if you want to ask questions. Actually, I've got a question here that I hadn't seen.
Heidi, yeah.
Yeah. Heidi's saying, I would love to know the following. If you see some signs of disengagement, etc., what are some of the questions you could ask these men to feel comfortable, to open up to you, rather than straight out asking if they experienced abuse, which would then lead into positive outcomes? So it's a really important question in terms of two frames of, where men are presenting in crisis, but we don't know whether they've experienced abuse, is to really demonstrate that services are up for the task of hearing men's stories and making disclosures without necessarily being, seeing a screening tool or something like this that ask men about their abuse history. So we know that, for example, many men that we spoke to talked about going through some of these screening tests, but not actually reporting abuse when they were asked for it in a fairly dispassionate, fairly impersonal way. So it's about actually showing that the service or practitioner can be up for the task and have some awareness. The other thing in terms of disengagement, I think, is when men have disclosed, that this was seen as a real vulnerable time for men at a whole range of levels. Firstly, at a level of their own safety, about having just told someone about the abuse. Where are they going after that? What support mechanisms do they have? What coping might they call upon? We saw that as a really vulnerable time for men, but also in terms of men feeling that perhaps in the past when they'd made a disclosure, they'd felt some rejection or some suspicion about their disclosure, and therefore they've disengaged. So it's almost something that the men are expecting to do. So I think it's really important how you follow up and support men around trust and speak fairly openly about other men's stories and your practitioner knowledge about what might be some possibilities for men. I hope that sort of answers Heidi's question. But certainly come back if it doesn't. Thanks. One of the things that we noticed, and it's probably unsurprising in some way, is that when you look at the men that participated in this study, they were older men or middle-aged young men. The older I get, the more I want to say move the age barriers of what is older or middle or young. But certainly stoicism is one important thing that men felt they just had to keep on going, and the fact that they were alive was an achievement. The fact that they had kept on going had been part of that achievement. And this man talks about a whole journey about being in prison, alcoholism, drugs, gambling, battles around harm and thinking of killing himself, but actually appreciating that he survived a lot. And I mean, some of these things relate to Heidi's question about some of the disengagement from what the effects are.